Science and Sustainability Fall Seminar Series, Managing for Climate Change. Today we have Keith Paustian, a senior research scientist here at the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory and a professor in Crop and Soils Department, providing this seminar today. Keith has been with us, associated with Colorado State University for more than half his life. I mean, he got his undergraduate degree here. He did go to University of Uppsala to get his PhD after for a short stay after leaving Fort Collins, and did a postdoc at Michigan State University. Is that correct? And then came back to really work with us on a number of things, looking at ecosystem dynamics and its influence on agricultural systems, working with one of our really great researchers here, Ted Elliott, and they really started this group looking at how do we actually look at agricultural systems, soil systems, and how they affect the world's dynamics through greenhouse gas emissions, and how do we manage our agricultural systems to reduce our impacts on the Earth systems. And so some of that he'll be sharing with us today. It's really a great pleasure having Keith here. I mean, he's been involved with so many things internationally as well, with the IPCC, leading efforts related to carbon mitigation. He was one of the several recipients from Natural Resource Ecology Lab, sharing recognition with the Nobel Prize. So with that, turn it over to Keith.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Great. Oh, I can also use the buttons there.
There we go. That works.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Dennis, and thanks for everyone showing up here on Friday after the snowstorm. So yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to come and give a presentation here. You know, I guess when Dennis twisted my arm, said, "Hey, you need to do a seminar," it's like, okay. You know, and then the hardest thing is always to come up with a title, right? And I thought, and I gave something, and then Susie asked me, and I gave kind of a boring title, and then a day later I sort of came up with, and I don't know, I was somehow thinking, it was a little bit of a flash. I said, okay, you know, pie in the sky, bringing it down to earth. I wanted to use that, so I told Susie. I was much more enthusiastic. I got that title in. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So I'm usually not a very funny guy, and I don't come up with good things. So, you know, once in a while, an old dog finds a bone, and there you go. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of background on climate change, soils, and greenhouse gases. This is, you know, I realize I'm talking to a crowd here, which is, you know, probably the highest concentration of experts in this topic anywhere in the world. But nonetheless, we'll, in case there's someone here that's needs a little bit of a refresher, we'll do that. Talk about management practices, again, focusing primarily at agricultural systems, and then talk about potentials. And this is really a key thing. Is this big enough to matter? Should we worry about it? Should we put effort into it? And then, you know, depending on that, there may be various policy approaches that we want to consider. And then for us here, scientists, what can science do? What can we do as researchers to try to push the ball forward here? And I think, as probably all of us, or most of us in the room know already, we've been doing quite a bit in this area to push the ball forward. And it's really, you know, it's a great place here, particularly NREL, but also CSU in general is really one of the, you know, essentially centers of the universe, or at least the Earth, in this area. Okay, so and so why do we care? And you know, we know that climate change is a really big deal, especially for humans. Okay, now that's what I think scientists understand in general. Not always our political leaders may not believe that. But irrespective, we have to go on. And so climate change is going to affect us in lots of ways. Okay, and here's I think this came from EPA, and you know, and they talk about, gee, we're going to have sea level rise and precipitation and, you know, crop yields affected and stuff. And I got this. I said, okay, I'm going to use this as an introduction to talk about how important, you know, climate change is and climate change impacts. And I started looking at it and said, you know, if you just look at this, it doesn't look all that bad. You know, it looks like, you know, gee, there's a nice beach here. You got sand, it's sunny, you know, and here's the earth and this nice, you know, moist water droplet around it. And, you know, birds are flying in the trees and, you know, farmer green jeans out there, and looks, you know, it's like, okay, maybe our messaging is not that great. And, you know, people say, ah, climate change, what's a big deal? They're looking at this. So I did go on the web and I came up with a better thing that really is going to get your attention, right? So climate change impacts, and you can, you know, you can look at this. I think it's kind of a cool, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely by any, you know, by any means. So it is serious business, and, you know, we are, you know, concerned with these impacts. Okay, so it's a big problem, and we got to do something about it. So, and you might ask, you know, what does that have to do with soils? Well, okay, it's a big problem. And we like to do big things, right? We like to come up with one-off solutions. And you know, to some degree, folks that are not necessarily climate change deniers, but maybe climate change foot draggers say, look, let's just, you know, we'll come up with something rather than do all this kind of painful energy conservation stuff like this. And I did come across, now I want to say this is after I came up with my own idea of the title and gave it to Susie, but I came up with a great idea that's now out on the web. It's called Cool Orbit, Pie in the Sky Geoengineering Competition. So the idea is that you could drag the Earth's orbit 7,200 kilometers farther from the sun, they reckon, and that'll reduce, you know, insolation. You also get 17 more extra minutes in bed each morning. So this will solve our problems. And all we have to do is anchor, I think it says 240 space shuttles anchored with high-strength cables, grounded in northern Asia, working for 28 months, could drag the Earth farther out to this new cool orbit. I have to send this to our Cool Planet folks and to see what they think. Or alternatively, if that, you could also set off 15 thermonuclear blasts at noon in the Pacific Ocean simultaneously, and that could nudge the Earth over. So you know, maybe we've got a big ticket solution, right, that we can go to. So anyway, and there's a bridge I'll sell you as well in New York, I think. Okay, so we don't really believe there's going to be any one-off solutions for this. And, you know, Steve Pacala, Rob Sokolow, back in 2004, published a paper in Science where they kind of came up with, I think, the existing paradigm that really makes sense. It's really a simple idea, but it's, okay, we've got emissions. I think this is looking at the US only, that are going up, and how do you bend that curve down? Well, you don't do it with 240 space shuttles tugging on the Earth, but you do it with lots of little things, okay? Lots of wedges. So this is the idea of climate wedges. So we've got to attack this problem with really an all hands on deck approach. So we've got to do lots of different things. This actually, I got the wedge diagram that's in the original Science paper is really a crummy diagram if you go back and look at it now. So I took a more colorful one that NRDC had up on the web. And if you look at those wedges, so there's lots of different things focusing on energy and fuel switching and other things, but you do see in here, they've got, you know, forest and soil carbon, and they've got also non-CO2 abatement, and both of those things potentially involve agriculture. So, you know, there's been thinking before that, some time ago that agriculture is potentially part of the solution. And as Dennis mentioned, I'll just say I got my start in this business when I was at Michigan State, and Ted Elliott was here. We had already met through the Swedish Agricultural Ecosystems Project back in the 80s. And then Ted sent me an email and said, hey, there's this RFP. EPA is going to give $1 million grant. This is like when was this? 1991 or something like this. $1 million grant, winner take all. They want to look at what can soil management do to sequester carbon. It's like, oh, that's cool. I got together with Elder Paul, Vern, Cole was here, and Ted, and we wrote a joint proposal that got funded. We got the winner take all, and that's how I kind of got started in looking at greenhouse gas stuff. Anyway, so and so there was thinking even back in the late 80s and 90s and stuff like this. But then looking forward, I would say soil carbon and greenhouse gas mitigation agriculture kind of sort of faded away, and was people were working on it, but it wasn't being talked around the town. And then the fifth assessment came out a couple of years ago, and they have these different projections of emissions here that we see we're around 50 petagrams of CO2 equivalents right now, and here's this kind of business as usual, we don't do anything, which is a really scary one in terms of where we end up with over 1,000 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere, really apocalypse and this sort of thing. And if we can bend this curve down, then kind of where we want to get, right, with respect to the Rio Treaty, is somewhere to stabilize by the end of the century, somewhere around this 450 ppm. Now that may or may not be sufficient to avoid this 2-degree warming. It's kind of hard to say, but this, it's really down in here that people are looking at as the, whether we'll make that or not is another question, but that's certainly, the aspirational goals. So we really have to do major greenhouse gas reductions. Of course, most of that is going to be from our fossil fuel economy to sort of take that out. But if you look further in this assessment, one of the things that comes out is, they run all these different integrated assessment models, and they see, okay, what kind of strategies will get us there? And one of the things that came out and was kind of highlighted in this fifth assessment was you can do all the things you want to do to, have electric vehicles and wind and solar and all that kind of stuff. When they run the models, they basically still came up and they said, okay, if we want to get these low CO2 scenarios achievable, it looks like almost all the models suggest that there's got to be some carbon sink from land. It has to be part of it. So the AFLU, the agriculture, forestry, and other land use has to actually become a net sink for some period of time. And these bars, the median numbers here are sort of around 3 to 5 petagrams of CO2 equivalents are the kind of mean sinks that would be needed according to these integrated assessment models to achieve this kind of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. So I think this kind of a finding really sort of lit a fire again underneath the whole issue of land management, because where are you going to get your carbon sinks from? Okay, you could get them from, chemical trapping of CO2 in the atmosphere. People are working on that, but that may be very expensive. Can we manage our ecosystems to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it in its soils and biomass? So there's been I would say there's been a renewed interest in the whole issue of sinks over the last couple of years. And in fact, if you were looking at yesterday's email in the Washington Post, there was a headline that said, this is where Obama's huge ambitious climate policies were headed before Trump came along. And this report, many of you have probably downloaded, taken a look at it. It's called the United States Mid-Century Strategy for Deep Decarbonization. Okay, so this came yesterday out of embargo, so it's out there on the web. You can download it. And kind of along the lines of what I was talking about, if you look at this, so here's a kind of a summary figure that says, okay, here's where we are right now in the US. So the blue is CO2 emissions. These are non-CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, CFCs, HFCs, this sort of thing. Here we've got a land sink. This is primarily, you know, our forests are still providing a sink. And then here's the net, you know, here we are somewhere around 6 petagrams or gigatons of CO2 equivalents, our current annual emissions. And by 2050, this document is saying we need to get down to here, somewhere net emissions below 2, you know, 1.5. And there's different ways you can do that with, for example, carbon sequestration through either BECCS or you know, taking CO2 out of power plant smokestacks and geological storage is this stuff. And then there's the sort of terrestrial land sink. And yeah, the biggest part is reducing CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, but you can see in all these different things, the White House analysis is saying, gee, there's a land sink component that really needs to be there to meet this goal. Okay, so that's kind of sets I guess the framework for what we're talking about. And if we think about land use in general and agriculture and specifically, you know, here's kind of what the picture is. If you look at the total net radiative forcing coming from agriculture as well as the other land use activities, deforestation, et cetera, right now it amounts to about 25% of the annual carbon equivalent or CO2 equivalent forcing, okay, due to human activities. So it's not a small sector. Agriculture, it's interesting though, over the past few years, the land use change has actually been a reduction in rates of deforestation. So we're actually making some improvements there, particularly in South America and Brazil. We're reducing, you know, carbon dioxide emissions from land use change and biomass burning some, but this is still a significant component. So the land use sector matters. If we look at what's involved in that whole land use emission and sink and source relationship, we can see a diagram like this, which is to be found in a number of places, including the 2006 IPCC National Inventory Guidelines that I was a convening lead author on, and Steve Ogle was a lead author, and I think Rich Conant was also involved in that. And Amy Swan here drew this beautiful cartoon, and it's been used over and over again by lots of people. So, you know, it's nice that NREL folks were right at the middle of these kind of activities. But what I like about this diagram is that, you know, it's easy on the eyes, but it also gives you this idea that, gee, this is really complex business, okay? There's multiple gases, the 3 big ones, of course, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. And there's all this interesting complexity of different sources and sinks, you know. So it's a great place to do research on because it's way more interesting, way more complex than just, you know, looking at fossil fuel emissions. But it can be a bit aggravating at the same time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about land use practices. And again, I'm going to kind of whip through this fairly quickly. Okay, if we're looking at carbon dioxide exchange with the land surface, we know that carbon dioxide is constantly cycling, right? There's huge fluxes going in, huge fluxes going out every year. So we don't really tend to think of necessarily trying to follow those fluxes, but what we can do instead is to say, okay, organic carbon that is stored, you know, in the ecosystem, where does it come from? Well, it comes from CO2 that's fixed by plants, and so we can get an idea of the net impact of our land use activities by looking at the change in carbon storage in the on the land surface. And for forests, of course, biomass is really important, long-lived woody biomass that is there for decades. But in the case of agricultural systems, the biomass is kind of ephemeral. It grows up and it's harvested and stuff. So really the major stock that matters is soil organic matter, okay? And how our practices impact that storage is pretty simple. It's, the classic kind of, water in the bathtub and coming in and coming out, right? So if you increase relative to native systems, if you increase the rate at which you're mineralizing that carbon dioxide through stimulating microbial activity in the soil, you get a big outgassing. If you reduce the amount of CO2 coming in, of carbon coming in via plant fixation and plant residues going into soil, then this storage, this box gets smaller, right? And we know that traditionally agriculture relative to natural systems, tended to do that. We had intensive tillage that stimulated organic matter. We had, we grew crops, but most of the productivity was removed for human consumption or animals, et cetera. So we've, historically have changed that balance, in the wrong direction, if you will. But it's, it's relatively simple, at least in principle, to say, okay, what do we do about that? Let's increase the carbon uptake, the amount going into the soil, and do things that will reduce the relative rates that CO2 is cycled back to the atmosphere. And here's various ways in terms of conservation systems and set-asides and perennial crops and these sorts of things. So we know that pretty well. Likewise, nitrous oxide. Okay, nitrous oxide is a biogenic emission, comes from two sources, from nitrification, denitrification, kind of depicted here. What do we do to try to manage that? Well, let's get more of this mineral N that is giving rise to those processes into the plant. Okay, so let's change our management that does that. And there are some things we can do to try to reduce those those fluxes to nitrous oxide, whether it be things like slow release, fertilizers, nitrification inhibitors, and this is sort of the whole idea of the 4 Rs. And people here, Stephen Ogle is working a lot on this as our our bigger group in terms of putting this into various systems. Methane, I didn't actually have anything up here about rice, but certainly in Colorado, the big sources of methane and generally in the US in particular are coming from the livestock sector. And there's different things we can do to deal with, the ruminant enteric methane production and also the production of these trace gases, from how we manage the manure. Okay, so that's kind of a quick run through of what land practices are potentially going to work to reduce emissions or give a net carbon sink occurring in agricultural systems. And, we've been studying this stuff for a long time, right? There's a lot of papers out there, and we know generally what works and what the relative magnitudes are. And I kind of put, the stuff in bigger, in bigger letters over here as kind of the stuff that has the bigger bang for the buck, and the more certain stuff is kind of, and then some things are maybe don't do quite as much, or we have a little bit more uncertainty about it. But there's a lot of research that we can base this on, but there's a lot of work to be done at the same time. So the point is, again, think of this complexity. And the point, I guess, the take-home point I want you to come away with is the idea that just about everything we do managing these agricultural systems has some kind of an impact on greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration. And so we've got some management levers, but some are stronger than others. And as I'll point out in a minute, the heterogeneity that exists out there in the systems makes this, a bit more complicated. Now, so this kind of gets to the question. So that's kind of like, what practices, we know something about the practices, but then, you want to sort of add all that up and people have been doing that for the last 20 or 25 years, I think, coming up with ideas of what's the potential mitigation from soil management. And there was, I would say there was kind of, I mentioned that we started, or I, personally started working with this in the early 90s. Somewhere about the mid 90s, late 90s, there was a lot of stuff you would see in the literature, and people were coming out with really pretty ambitious estimates that, gee, soil carbon, that's the thing. And then it kind of went, and then, in some ways, thankfully, that kind of went away, a little bit of that sort of cheerleader stuff, and it, got a little bit debunked. But really, in the last couple of years, it's sort of starting a little bit all over again. And so one of the things I think that it's a challenge is, you go out and you look on the web and stuff like this, and and here's the climate wise guy says, oh, the soil can save us, it can sequester CO2, and the rabbit says, oh, there's hope. Oh yes, there's hope. Microbes and plants can put that soil back into the soil if we treat them right. So it's kind of like, this is really a great solution, and it's not. And I don't mean to disparage that, obviously, but the problem is sometimes you also see, there's a white paper the Rodale Institute gave out a couple of years ago, and they say, gee, if we could switch to available inexpensive organic management practices, so regenerative organic agriculture, we could sequester 100% of the annual CO2 emissions. And those kind of things are, I actually looked at this, and they had 4 papers. One cited was a Conant and Paustian that they took a number out and multiplied it by some massive amount. And so we're partly to blame for this, but not really. In Australia, there was, as some of you might know, Australia actually had a climate change. They signed on to the Kyoto Protocol, then they got back out. One of the things that they did actually back in the late, in 2008, 2009, was they came up with, a mitigation policy that involved a pretty substantial part. I think something like 25 or 30% of their total commitment was going to come from land use sinks. And what they did was they sort of took, again, technical potentials and assumed that 100% of the farmers were going to adopt these, and they were going to do it for $3 an acre, and everything was going to be hunky-dory, right? Well, it didn't work out so well because the farmers kind of said, well, what do you mean $3 an acre? The heck with that. And, at the time there, so this is back in 2009, farm soil will offset emissions in Australia's thing, and Christine Jones, who's a soil scientist there, I don't know her, but she said, yeah, if we just manage our agricultural soils properly, we can make Australia carbon neutral for decades. So this is, some of the stuff that's out there. There's other stuff out there. We, several of us, Steve and I, and some colleagues in the UK and in Michigan and Cornell, Phil Robertson, Jonas Lehman, managed to get a paper in Nature talking about this stuff. And we put together a kind of a summary diagram that looks like this. And what you can see from here is, I guess, a couple of interesting things to point out. And one is that depending on what activities you're doing, so this is kind of on a log scale here, there's a different amount of per hectare mitigation that you can achieve, okay? And there's a few things you can do out here that potentially have a real big effect on a relatively small area. Like if you can take cultivated organic soils and re-wet those, turn them back into a peatland, essentially, you can potentially start to sequester large amounts of carbon and and have a real high sink potential. But here's the area at which you can adopt these practices, and there's not that many organic cultivated soils. So yeah, you can get a big effect on a small area, but there's not that much area you can apply it to. And then conversely, there's, if you think generally about grazing land, cropland. Okay, there's a lot of it around the world, and you can do reduced tillage and change your crop rotations and other things, and maybe you can apply biochar. There's a lot of interest now. Can you have enhanced root phenotypes that put more carbon deeper into the soil? But in general, most of these kind of things still are going to have fairly modest amounts per unit area of mitigation. So they're going to have to be effective. You're really going to have to apply those over a big land area. Okay, so that's really one of the challenges. We came up with an estimate, for this technical potential, not at all 100% of current. Remember, the current is about 50 petagrams. So we say, okay, the technical potential, relatively conservatively, I guess, is somewhere 6 to maybe 16% of total global emissions. So that's a significant amount. That's a pretty good climate wedge, right? But the point of this, though, this is like the technical potential. It's a little bit like the Australians. So if you could get 100% of the people to do the things that would make sense, you could get that. But you're not going to get that. So there's going to be an economic or a policy potential that's going to be quite a bit lower than this. And we don't really know what that is yet, but we may find out at some point. There have been some estimates of more of this economic potential. This is actually Pete Smith led the I think this is the 4th assessment, the agriculture chapter in the 3rd volume. And what's kind of interesting about that? So that it actually, this is not from this is from the summary for policymakers. They basically said, okay, looking at all the different sectors for greenhouse gas mitigation, what is it going to cost and how much mitigation are you going to get for a given price of carbon? What's kind of interesting about this is, well, you can see here buildings, okay, the way to get the most mitigation for the least cost is to, insulate your buildings and have better windows and this sort of thing. So, they come out on top. But then if you look at kind of little agriculture that sort of is always the forgotten child in the room in a way when you come to COP meetings and stuff like this. And they came up and said, well, agriculture actually stacks up really well as a fair amount of mitigation at a reasonable price, So it may be, in fact, we don't know yet, but there's certainly, analyses out there, credible ones that suggest that of all the different activities you can do, that agriculture may, have a pretty good role to play. Okay, so if there's a reasonable potential and even an economic potential, then it comes down to how do we incentivize farmers to do this stuff, really? Because they've got to do the stuff on the ground. Okay, you can put a tax. You can say, okay, what you're doing now isn't good, so we're going to tax that behavior. You can do subsidies. We do that a lot, I think, in the U.S. You do it a lot in Europe as well. You can have carbon markets where essentially greenhouse gas mitigation is a new co-product of agriculture. So it's not just producing food, it's producing, carbon. People talk about carbon farming, but that can be other things, water quality, whatnot. And you can also look at the demand side. You can say consumer preference. Okay, can we find ways to say, to make this product more attractive to consumers? If we can say, okay, there's you can buy a greener product that has a lower carbon footprint, then maybe people will do that, and that will drive, the incentives for farmers to do more of this stuff. At least in the U.S., I think taxes, at least directly on the farmers, not going to work, especially now. Taxes, farmers are mostly in red states, and they have a pretty big voice there. If the rest of us were paying a carbon tax, that would be a good thing. But okay, so we're not going to do taxes directly on farmers, but we can do other things. At least right now, USDA has historically given a lot of subsidies and payments and assistance for conservation practices, and they're doing that now. And actually, Secretary Vilsack earlier in the year announced his climate building blocks, which are really the first time that the conservation practices that USDA was promoting were really kind of aligned with climate and not just soil erosion and water quality and this sort of thing. In the EU, you know, the EU in general has been sort of forward thinking on greenhouse gas mitigation. With respect to land, previously they've really just said, okay, we're just going to look at our forests, and you've probably heard about the term Kyoto forests. So they basically said, you know, countries are going to map their forests, they're going to be looking at afforestation, deforestation, this sort of thing. And actually a couple, 3 years ago, they made a decision that, you know, okay, we need to include in our Kyoto Protocol accounting system also cropland and grassland. So the legislature actually made a decision on this, the EU Parliament. And then I happened to be together with Francesca in northern Italy at the Joint Research Commission of the European, or Joint Research Center for the European Commission, you know, a year and a half ago. And it was kind of funny because people said, well, yeah, they passed this law, but they didn't ask us how we're going to do it. And so now there's all kinds of people going around, you know, how the heck are we going to do this now? Because we're, you know, are we going to be able to track this at the national scale, every parcel of cropland and grassland? And of course I said, oh yeah, we can do that. We'll just, you know, give us a research contract. We'll show you how to do it. We're still waiting, but okay, other mitigation policies, these market-based offsets. So we know there are things like the voluntary markets have been around for quite a while, things like VCS, American Carbon Registry, and they do a lot of stuff, particularly internationally, but a little bit in the US. And there are some agriculture types products. They're, you know, they're not dominant. They're still kind of growing, but movement is happening there. And then, of course, in the US, the big thing is actually a compliance cap and trade market in California, the Air Resources Board. Now, of course, they've capped fossil fuel emission sectors primarily, and they're not capping agriculture, but they are beginning to allow some agricultural projects to enter this space as offset projects, really. So, and we've been involved a little bit with some of the development on the science side of folks that are working there. And then I think the final area of sort of policy interventions that really seems to be growing a lot now, I think, is this idea of consumer preference. So it's on the supply chain. It's, and lots of companies, whether it's Unilever or PepsiCo or Coca-Cola and Walmart, are saying, gee, we think millennials are going to want to buy low carbon footprint products, and so we need to find ways of doing this. So if you think about all these different mitigation options and implementation strategies, I think there's a common issue there, and that is that for any of them, a really key issue is to have effective policies. To have effective policies, you really need good metrics, okay? You've got to be able to quantify and verify what these emission reductions are, and that's, thinking back to Amy's diagram, that's a difficult job. There's all that complexity there. These are all non-point source. You know, most of us in this room have tried to measure these things at one time or another. They're dispersed across the landscape, spatially, temporally variable. They're at heart biogenic processes that we're perturbing with human activities. So they're controlled by lots of interacting processes, by, you know, soil temperature and you know, and soil moisture and soil texture and you know, nitrogen contents and all kinds of other stuff. And, you know, yes, you can go out and you can measure these things, and sometimes it's not so easy to do it, but in any case, the measurement, you really require specialized equipment and training and stuff, okay? So you're not going to deploy it out in the landscape for a mitigation project. It's really a research activity. And it's a great jobs program for graduate students, right? So we've got lots of our guys out doing this sort of thing. Probably don't want farmers are going to ask them to strap a bag on top of their cow to measure enteric methane. They're likely to tell you to go somewhere that I won't repeat. So again, it's not going to happen out there on the land on a routine basis. It's going to be us who are going to be doing it. But then if we want to implement this on these hundreds of millions of hectares and stuff around the world, we're going to need good model-based approaches that can be applied at this farm scale or project scale. And, you know, a lot of people have been working on this problem. And if you go out there and you say, gee, what are, now looking at sort of farm level stuff, what are the greenhouse gas calculators? And there's a whole raft of them out there. You know, we've been working in this space since back in, I don't know, I'd have to ask Mark to remember, because he was the one that did this original little IPCC soil carbon tool, but I think it was, you know, 1997 or something like this. And then we had a system called Comet VR. We went to a web-based system, et cetera. But I guess the point I wanted to make here, maybe a little bit of bragging, is that, you know, there are different calculators, and some just do a few sources and some do many of this complexity. Some use pretty simple kind of static models. Some use more dynamic process-based, and there's different ways you can get that. But I think right now the stuff that we're doing here is largely operating out here in a space that's a little bit unique in terms of really being comprehensive, being state-of-the-art, and being available up on the web. So just to tell you just a little bit before I close about that system, Comet Farm, it's a, you know, a full within farm gate greenhouse gas accounting. A couple years ago, USDA published this big fat blue book called the Entity Scale Greenhouse Gas Methodology. Steve Ogle, who is here, was one of the lead authors, was the lead author on the agriculture chapter here. But this looked at agriculture, forestry, wetlands, you know, and livestock. So it's really a comprehensive, it took 3 years, several public and peer review. So it's really I kind of think a very solid document. And the beauty, I think, of the way, you know, we've structured Comet Farm is Comet Farm then takes all this complexity and it implements it in this web-based tool. And to do that, I'll tell you just a little bit about it. It uses a lot of databases. It uses, you know, some pretty sophisticated GUI and other kind of software engineering that the crew down in Shepherdson that Kevin Brown is leading have been doing. And it also is able to take on-the-fly models like they said and run those, you know, in the background on the web to do this. And it's an open access, it's free, it's getting increasing lots of use. This is kind of the way it looks like. You come in here, it's a beautiful piece of software, if I say so myself, but I say that not having contributed at all to any of the programming. Obviously, Steve is chuckling, you know, yeah, you're programming? Yeah, well, it's been a while. It's been a while. Dave would remember the days I used to program. That was, we weren't doing this stuff. There was no web at that time, right? So you go into Comet Farm and you go through here and you pick your areas and do all the cool stuff, and then you can outline your management stuff, come around with reports. There's all kinds of new, if you haven't done it, just Google Comet Farm, go in there. I just came from a class a few minutes ago in Francesca's class. They've spent a week talking about this stuff, and today they're doing an online, or they're doing a laboratory using this, and it went great this morning. Where I think this eventually takes us is to a place that I think is really going to be critical if this implementation is going to happen. And that is, we've got to find a way to have the land users, the farmers, the ranchers, the people that are on the landscape doing the activities need to get engaged in this in a different way than has happened before. And there's a lot of science here that, you know, we can now bring to bear and help deliver, you know, to land users, but not only the land managers, but NRCS staff or crop consultants, other people that are not necessarily greenhouse gas specialists. But, you know, once we do that, I think we're going to open up a lot of opportunities for agriculture to, you know, improve our inventories and stuff, but also participate in things like these ecosystem service markets. And I just wanted to close out then with a final slide. This is again, this was the diagram I hoped that would be in the Nature paper that Amy also gets the credit for, her beautiful design. The Nature guys didn't, they modified it a bit. It's not, the Nature paper diagram is not nearly as good as Amy's original one, so I want to use that one. And basically it says, where does science come in on this to really help push the ball forward? And, part of it is, yeah, we need to continue to study and understand and develop new practices. And a lot of people here, whether it's Francesca that's working on biochar and other folks, and Jim and Megan and Steve Fonte are, looking at things like cover crops and organic amendments, et cetera. So there's a lot of activities going on. It has been for years at CSU, helping us, develop new, better practices. Even more so, I think, on this kind of science and technology side. We've got a lot to contribute here. We're doing a lot, whether it's, the advanced greenhouse gas models, Bill and Dennis and Steve and myself and others, working with Dept and Century and other models like that. Lots of basic research. Here at NREL, we basically have the U.S. soil carbon monitoring system. Hasn't been fully funded, but Steve has been leading that effort that USDA has been supporting. So we're building up, advanced monitoring networks and stuff like this. And then, and then finally over here, what can science do to support implementation? And there it's things like these decision support tools, but also, the technologies, things like inventory methods, that again, Steve is working on ALU. We've got the CBP system and Comet. We're increasingly working with, companies, Ben & Jerry's and Coca-Cola and others to do these things. So I think there's a huge role for science. NREL and CSU scientists are right in the middle of this stuff, doing a tremendous amount of things right now. And so I think there's a bright future for us. We've got lots of work to do. We'll see what happens over the next few years, but I think we keep going on. So I'd like to close out then. We're fortunate to have a visit by Secretary Vilsack here in the spring. He came out and he knew about the Comet Farm tool and wanted to meet the whole crew here. So Ernie, of course, found a place right near the front. And Mark, of course, wanted to sidle up to the secretary. So they did that well. I got stuck out here on the end, kind of insignificant. And then Shoba and Crystal managed to hold up the banner there. So it's been a great run. We hope to keep it going. And we're, it's great that there's so many people here at NREL and CSU. This is not really the full group of people, but it's been a lot of fun working. So thanks. Sorry if I took too much time, but I guess there's a couple minutes for questions maybe. Yeah, thanks. That was great. There's a lot of things in there. Okay, update on questions.
Yeah, you have these agricultural techniques that will increase carbon sequestration. What are the effect of most of these on agricultural production?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's the big balance, right? You've got to find ideally the sort of the win-win stuff, and there's certainly opportunities for that where farmers can actually in the long run get more productivity and also increase soil carbon or more efficient nitrogen use. But it may be that they have to, they have to get over an adjustment period of 2 or 3 years or something like this. And it all comes down to economic. It may be also, okay, can you accept a little less, let's say nitrogen fertilizer? Okay, you may get a slight decline in yields, but if you're spending less money on fertilizer, and if you're also getting a payment for reduced N2O or something like that, then your net returns could be higher, and production not that much affected. But that's, for sure, it's going to have to be that, you know, the farmers are going to see in effect a profit on this one way or the other. And so for sure, we're not going to be able to do this by saying, you know, let's take half of the ag land and just put it into to grasses or something like that. Okay, that's, you know, that would give us a lot of carbon sequestration, but it would not work out, at least in the short term, you know, economically. I don't know.
Oh, I see. I mean, me and many others of us that work more like in the barricades, we spent a lot of time working on the concept of resistance and how much this carbon will stay in the soil. And for you to kind of do that and understand that, you Lane and many others, but also, you know, bridge all the way up to this thing, when you use numbers, it's always carbon sequestration per year, but nobody says, and it will stay for so long. And so I'm wondering, you know, where is that lost in translation? I know that you guys appreciate it, but why is not communicated? Nobody pays attention to for how long?
So it depends on what you know, for sure it gets lost in translation with the, you know, the cartoons with a rabbit and the farmer sort of a thing, right? Where there it is. But, you know, I think in most of the, you know, in most of the policy documents, or, you know, whether it's the state of the carbon cycle reports, and certainly in the scientific papers, you know, because otherwise you get the referees all over you. You need to talk about. No, if you read the caption, it talks about this is like a potential that would be over a 20-25 year period, and after which time, for most of those practices, you reach a new equilibrium. Okay, but I'm pretty sure it's in there. If it's not, it's Steve's fault. He didn't. He overlooked it then. And Ernie,
sort of along those lines. Like you're now, I mean, you're calling it like at the beginning you had your 100-year, like you're looking out century, stuff like that. And you're talking about these carbon sinks, and if you think of this sink, it's sort of we're refilling a sink that we emptied for tillage and stuff like that over time. But once we fill that sink and we get back to equilibrium, like isn't it like is there a finite amount that we can fill that sink, and then we get to a new equilibrium and we can't really project out for a century?
Yeah, and there's, you know, and that's a good point. You know, and there have been estimates, and I've a couple of papers I've been on have stated as much, and, you know, estimates. One where you could start with is probably a reasonable upper limit, is say, okay, what was the soil carbon content under native systems? And we know we're not likely to exceed that, right? Unless although who knows, there may be weird genetic engineering we do. You know, I don't want to speculate on what happens in 2050. And, you know, ARPA-E now is putting a bunch of money into saying, gee, can we create, can we create phenotypes that put a lot more roots in the ground? And of course, you know, can you do that without taking too much dry matter allocation from the grain? You know, just yesterday, Adam Chambers, our NRCS person that was working with us, sent us, he's been talking to Patagonia. Patagonia has a new beer that is made from perennial grains that they're growing in Kansas at the Lance Institute in Salinas. It's some kind of a perennial wheatgrass, and now they're starting to get, you know, they don't have wheat-like yields yet, but, you know, they've got this gamma grass or intermediate wheatgrass or something like this that has, you know, roots that go down to 3 meters, and you know, so it's hard to say long term, but for sure sinks saturate at some point, and they're not, you know, they're not a long-term solution. But I think the point still of these assessments is, okay, gee, we could really use something between, you know, 2020 and 2060 to help, you know, before we get, you know, nuclear fusion or electric airplanes, I don't know. And, you know, and there, I think there is a spot for land use to play a role in that kind of intermediate thing. And if at the same time we have better, healthier soils, then that's all good. But, you know, getting there is another matter. We'll see.
So Keith, a couple of weeks ago, Barry Moore was here, and he was talking about the landscape and very much the importance of this in the mitigation. But then he was also asking, you know, and us in the room, how much is the CO2 fertilization effect, especially in agricultural systems, contributing to the land sink?
The way that I would say the way that we do our estimates is always sort of relative to baselines in terms of, you know, data from long-term experiments. So there may be a fertilization effect that's going on, but it's kind of netted out, right? Because if you're looking at you know, improved, it's largely netted out because you know, it's there all the time, right? But if you say, okay, well, I've got reduced tillage, well, you know, that doesn't change, but you're affecting, you know, mineralization or something, or if you're changing your crop. So I think the more important question that in a way is, you know, is it's all good to say about netting out, but, you know, there was a paper in Science about 2 or 3 weeks ago where they were actually looking at sort of the natural land sink driven by, if I understand it right, the Sue Trumbore and some of those guys, driven by the CO2 fertilization, okay, the present 1.5 or whatever, there are 2 gigatons of carbon that they're estimating is the, you know, what we used to call the missing sink, and I guess now we say it's not really missing anymore. But, you know, for sure there's concern that that is potentially weakening and maybe a lot less. It seems like most of the integrated assessment models count on there being a fair amount of that CO2 fertilization driven carbon sink into the future, and their paper in Science said, hey, it may be a whole lot less than this, in which case, you know, things look more dire. I think that's a good point. The management levers, though, are a little bit of a different thing. I think, you know, they go along perhaps with the CO2 fertilization, but yeah, I think you can look at them, you know, somewhat independently as well.
Well, let's thank Keith again. This has been great. Just a reminder, next week we won't have this because of the fall break, but on December 2nd, we have Jessica Thorne, a new postdoc here at the Natural Resource Ecology Lab, working with Julia Klein on mountain systems, giving her presentation on December 2nd. So we'll see you then.
I know you did. A lot of plugs. I
I
didn't
know
even
that
know
was
that
your
you
big all the time.
Well, it was a shared authorship on that.